Okay, good evening, everyone. We are happy to welcome you back to the third episode of our Marxism Online Talk. I am Edward Daniel, your host from Marxism Discussion Group. Tonight, we are accompanied by Professor Prasenjit Biswas, who will be presenting a material under the topic Ethics of Everyday Politics. Zizek, Badiou, and Laruelle's philosophical transcritique. We have talked about the philosophical basis of Marxism in our first episode with Dr. Talha. And then at the second episode, we talk about Slavoj Zizek as a contemporary heterodox Marxist. And we are going to continue with more complex ideas. Let me read to you a short summary by Professor Biswas to set the tone of tonight's discussion. So, boundaries of ethical and political has been a major concern for theorizing everyday situations in both politics and philosophy. The latter overdetermining the former. Unfolding the subject language after tarrying with the transmutation of defense of the subject of desire, one needs to arrive at a transcritique of subject as an everyday non-philosophical being who can just live in end times. This transcritique shall follow a trajectory from Badiou to Zizek to Laruelle and explore the very metaphysics of liberation as an experiential form of life. The talk is built around aporias within and outside acts of worldling from an alternating epistemic praxiological stance. So Professor Prasenjit Biswas is a thinker of alternative within continental philosophy. He teaches in philosophy at Northeastern Hill University, Shillong, India. His last published work is Between Philosophy and Anthropology, Aporias of Thought, Language and Consciousness. Professor Biswas will deliver a presentation in 40 to 50 minutes. Before then, we jump into the session of question and answer. So please turn off your microphone to keep everything in order. So without further ado, everyone, please welcome Professor Biswas.
Okay. It's wonderful to really meet Edward, Heber, and their team, which goes by the name of a Marxism Discussion Group. But as I understand, it's primarily philosophical and also political. And it establishes the essential link between philosophy and politics. To talk about Marxism, of course, when we say Marxism, we are not talking about 19th century or 20th century Marxism. Rather, we are talking about a Badiouian Marxism, the way L.A. Badiou espouses Marxism, the way Slavoj Zizek brings into the question of symbolic and real in order to understand the labor-capital relationship, or the way Laruelle finally thinks about a certain kind of radical immanence of resistance in facing the world by the individual and the collective is a rather transmuted, a rather transformed idea of Marxism as a framework of knowledge, resistance, and power, which is espoused by contemporary continental philosophers in so many different ways. Of course, the fundamental of Marxism in terms of class struggle, in terms of resistance, or in terms of thinking about revolutionary overthrow of the existing power structure, some of it are very differently described in Marxism or Marxist, or rather post-Marxist understanding of Marxism in 21st century, in the century now. So I want to take you to some of these new ways of understanding the relationship between the subject and the world, which encompasses the relationship between resistance and knowledge, which brings into picture the processes of production of knowledge and subjectivity on the other hand, and also an understanding of these acts of production in terms of its relationship with the existing modes of repression, existing modes of libidinal economy, or existing modes of even using language, which is the mainstay of philosophy. So therefore, to put the thing in a more simpler way is to talk about the relationship between the subject and the world, is to reconfigure both the subject and the world. Now, one way of reconfiguring the subject and the world is in terms of the relation that obtains between the subject and the world. So to start with, the fundamental question that Badiou is asking is that what is the relationship between the subject and the world? Is it an epistemic relationship? Is it a political relationship? Or is it an ethical relationship? What kind of relationship obtains between the subject and the world? That's the most fundamental question before us. And this question is answered in a variety of ways by this entire range of philosophers, which I want to cover here in this 40 to 45 minutes. So to begin with, Elie Badiou's notion of subject, which is a subject not constituted entirely by the world. Doesn't mean that it is constituted by subjectivity, but it is constituted by a complex process of how subjectivity represents itself in language, and how that representation of subjectivity in language becomes a worldly representation for Badiou. That's Badiouian framework. So to generalize the Badiouian framework, one can say that Badiou moves from subject to the world via language, to the medium of language. If this medium of language is taken away, then all the expressions out the expressions of subjectivity amounts to a death of both the subject and the language. So a subject language for Badiou has to be alive. It has to capture the living activity of subjects in interaction with each other, how subjects create a world by way of sharing a certain scheme of transformation, or a certain scheme of acting upon each other's dreams, drives, and desires. So subjects act upon each other. They act in an active sense and not in a passive sense. Now this distinction that Badiou draws between activity and passivity, apparently, is from the entire Greek philosophical tradition. Activity, as you know in Aristotle, is something like a material cause becoming an efficient cause. That is activity. A cause which is materially available, like a substance, and how that cause turns itself into becoming a substance with a different set of qualities that substance can acquire. So in other words, the transformation of one subject into another subject is by way of a transformation of the nature of substance itself in Aristotle. And this transformation of the nature of substance is something that continued in the modern Western metaphysics, which is continued through Descartes, continued through Spinoza, continued through Leibniz. But this continuity of the notion of substance, as substance changes itself from a certain state and moves to a higher or an enhanced state, is something that creates certain metaphysical problems. Can the human subjectivity be reduced to the status of a substance? Is an important question that Badiou raises. For Badiou, substance is reducible to subjectivity. but subjectivity is not reducible to a substance. Now, substance is not something like the objective world, which is externally available, but substance is this relation that grounds a subject in the world. That is something very, very important. Substance is the name of the relation that grounds the subject in the world. And once this subject is grounded in the world, what happens is that the subject produces a certain sense of finitude, a certain sense of a situation in which the subject belongs to. So subject as substance and not substance as subject is something that is very, very important for Badiou. And this is how Badiou, in a sense, changes Aristotelian notion of, or Aristotelian duality between material cause and efficient cause into subject as substance by giving up the notion of substance as subject. Now, subject as substance is grounded in the world. It's grounded in the form of a multiplicity. An individual subject is not necessarily a differentiated, individuated subject, but it is a subject which is in an interrelationship. Now, the global possibility of having an interrelationship between one subject and another simultaneously transcends the subject as well as grounds them in the world by creating a sense of situation or immanence. So subject is simultaneously grounded as well as transcended in the relation. And this relation in which the subject is transcended, that relation itself is grounded in the immanence of a situation. Now, seemingly here, Badiou is taking a Hegelian turn, and it is something politically very, very important. This Hegelian turn separates the movement of absolute spirit into this acts of grounding a subject as a substance. So subject becomes the name of an inactive process of grounding, an inactive process of spirituality, an inactive process of probably separating the spirit from the subject. Subject is in inactivity. Subject is in the act of grounding. Subject is ontological. So there is this ontological moment of the subject, which Badiou celebrates in the form of the interrelationship, the whole gamut of interrelationship in which the subject is locatable in the world. So what happens then? Subject as substance enters into the world of relations. And this world of relations is something like, Badiou calls it a situation. It's a kind of a belonging. And the state of a situation is that by means of which the structure of a situation in turn is counted as one, Badiou would say. So the situation assumes the form of a structure. So what is happening here? The subject as a substance becomes the name of an action, and the action is grounded in the world, and this grounded action by the subject, of the subject, in and around the subject, gives rise to a situation in the world. And this is something radically very different than other philosophers who have conceived of a static idea of subjectivity, or a static idea of intersubjectivity, or a static idea of being a substance. So subject is no longer being a substance. In a sense, the subject is erased in the process of arriving at a situation. And this is something fundamentally different than, let's say, Karl Marx's notion of situated subjectivity in class consciousness. Or it is fundamentally different from Hegel's notion of subjectivity, when subjectivity is differentiated, abstracted, and at the same time moved towards a higher level, all within the gamut of consciousness. So Badiou takes a turn away from the gamut of consciousness. And when he takes a turn away from the gamut of consciousness, he is retaining the Hegelian content of the possibility of grounding the subject, which Hegel also retained. And Hegel retained it in the form of a certain kind of a meaning, in the form of a certain kind of what the subject expresses and what the subject actually is. What the subject expresses is a certain drive, is a certain response, which is different from what the subject actually is. The subject actually is grounded in a situation. And what the subject expresses is a certain kind of representation. So there is this perpetual gap between representation and the situation. Now, Badiou tries to close off this gap by saying that the state of the situation is necessarily a certain kind of presentation. State of the situation is a certain kind of a presentation, and that presentation is important. What the situation presents is important. Now, Badiou theorizes about what the situation presents. The situation presents, of course, an inactive, grounded subject, a subject which is moved by a certain spirit to enact its own subjectivity, to express its own subjectivity. So a certain spirit that moves the subject is very much there along the subject. Now, this spirit cannot be entirely an embodied spirit. It cannot be entirely identified with a self or an individual or something that acts as a center of consciousness. Hegel also would agree that spirit in its final journey can become consciousness. The spirit in its interim possibilities of moving through the entire trajectory of transforming itself by responding to the duality between the mind and the world, between the labor and the capital, and some such things, which can be all conceptualized as a duality between being and becoming, let's say. In the process, subject becomes only a spirit, and subject is not able to retain a kind of an absolute subjectivity. But in the journey, through this journey of the spirit, subject regains its consciousness in Hegel. Now, Badiou seems to be more or less going in the same direction, because subject has to be turned into a situational agent. The agency of the subject must be put to a grand set of relations with other subjects, which is how the subject would move itself in the process of finding a place in the world. And finding a place in the world is a kind of a multiplicity. It's a kind of a historicity. It's a kind of an event. When the subject finds a place in the world, that itself is an event. And the event of the subject finding a place in the world is something that is celebrated by Badiou, by calling it some kind of a metastructure, that the subject finds a place in the world is not just a situation, but it's a metastructure. It's the structure of a situation, which itself is a structure. Now, situation has this structure of an event happening in space and time. Now, what the situation brings, that also has a structure in the form of a background history, in the form of a certain spirit that moves the structure, that moves the subject into an action, and thereby the subject finds a place within the structure, which is like a metastructure. Now, finding the place is not the end of the subjectivity. It's just a means for an end. The means to find finding a place itself is a means so that the subject can intervene in the evolving situation. So how does the subject intervene in the evolving situation? The subject intervenes by way of configuring and reconfiguring a generic procedure, where you would say. The subject gives rise to a procedure of understanding, a procedure of reasoning, a procedure of acting. And this procedure consists of a finite set of inquiries. The subject inquires upon a part of the situation. A subject who is inquiring on a part of the situation is actually trying to move from one part to another part, is trying to move within a situation in a manner that the subject is finally able to overcome the situation by way of reaching at a point which the subject desires to reach at. So therefore, you can see here a certain kind of a drive of the subject. And when the subject reaches to a desired position, that position once again is a reconfiguration of the relationships in which the subject is embedded in the world. Now, what is this nature of this relationship? Is the relationship entirely a kind of a contemplative, speculative, and metaphysical relationship, as is taught about in a certain kind of metaphysics of presence, as Heidegger would be doing? Heidegger would be conceiving the situation of a subject and the outreach of the subject as a movement outward, and this outward movement has to finally coalesce itself into an original consciousness of being in the world. Now, Badiou's subject doesn't return to an original consciousness of being in the world. It simply moves from one situation to another. It experiences a certain kind of singularity, a certain sense of being singular when the subject moves from a situation to a desired location, and then from there to a further situation, and yet to another situation. So this process of subject moving from one situation to another situation by moving through the periphery of the situation, by trying to alter a situation in order to find a different position, is a liminal activity. It's not an activity in the sense of having a prior positive agenda in terms of which subject would be able to move from one situation to another, as conceived by 19th century or 20th century Marxism, and as continued in the metaphysics of presence, because subject cannot shear off, cannot subtract its very presence in the act of, in its acts of consciousness, in its acts of making difference with other subjects, or in its act of identification, or even alienation. In every state of existence, the subject should be able to recover its subjectivity as a subject in the world, as a being in the world, whose consciousness is complete by itself, both in terms of actuality and potentiality, as if consciousness is able to combine all the possibilities into a certain kind of given relationship. That's how Heidegger would be talking about the subject. And that's nothing but a transformation of the modern bourgeois subject, the bourgeois subject that Marx talks about in the Capital, in the form of an accumulating subject, in the form of a subject that turns use value into exchange value. And when use value turns into exchange value, the value part of value is completely transformed into something like a surplus, which is quantified not as a value, but as something different than its constituents, such as labor or capital, labor and capital are both transformed into a notion of surplus, which is something like an enhanced reproduction, as Marx would call it. And Heidegger would like to think that this enhanced reproduction is a return to the absolute form of subjectivity. Now, Badiou's argument is very different from Heidegger. Badiou sees at every step of the subject that the subject is subtracting the weight of the subjectivity in order to situate herself in the world. And in order to situate herself in the world, the subject is continually moving to a successive situation. Subject is becoming a successor subject, which is disconnected and disjointed from the subject which was before. The subject that was before and the subject that is after are entirely different. And this entirely different subject opens up the possibility of the successor subject intervening in a situation. From the periphery of a situation, the intervening subject can walk and reenact its own subjectivity by shearing off the entire past baggage. It don't have to carry the sediments of historicity with itself. Now this is something like taking the subject out of the cycle of capitalist mode of production as well. The subject, by way of its movement, by the spirit of altering the situation, is in a position to move out of the bounds of capital. And this movement out of the bounds of capital is something limited, something liminal. It's a kind of an intervention into the situation. And the nature of the intervention is such that the subject can always place itself outside the governing, the dominant, the structured relationship, because subject has a meta structure that can overcome the given structure. So this is a kind of a different formulation of an argument. And this is how the subject is able to make use of a certain kind of incompleteness, a certain kind of never fully formed state of subjectivity, which leads into a certain kind of a enhanced enactment of its goals and desires. Now this point that Badiou makes is different from libido, libidinal economy that Lacan would be trying to talk about, because Lacan would be talking about that the subject would be moving from one particular position in the symbolic structure to another position in the same symbolic structure. The governing rules of a symbolic structure, the name of the father, will never change until and unless there is a patricide. But most of the subjects cannot commit a patricide, which is an impossibility. Now, without committing patricide, without changing the symbolic order, how can subject place itself outside a given symbolic order? Is a strategic question. And this strategic question is answered by Zizek in so many different ways. I would like to mention one or two ways in which Zizek takes the subject out of the bounds of the symbolic. Now, Zizek would say simply that the subject is subversive by its very presence. And the subversive subject not only subverts the situation in which the subject belongs to, but a subversive subject subverts the dominant symbolic order in which it is emerging, in which it is arising from. So there are this possible interpretative disruption of the ego-directed movements of the subject from a basic symbolic to a new symbolic, to gradually produce an awareness of an insistent something, as if there is an insistent something, there is an underlying force, and also there is something which is emerging in the horizon, and it is something insistent. And this gives rise to a certain kind of capacity to subvert its own individuality, so that from the pre-individuality state to the adult individuality state to a state of continually questioning the already formed psyche, the already formed symbolic order, by way of coming out of the process of subjugation by a symbolic order. Now, this is, in a sense, escaping the processes of subjugation, processes of domination, even the processes of repression within a symbolic order. Because Lacanian Marxism, by banking on the possibility of imagining what is going to happen in future, which is a certain kind of an imaginary future, or an imaginary projection of the symbolic into a different space and time, into a different temporality, is something that subjects keep doing in the form of an imaginary. And this imaginary confronts the reality of oppression, the reality of repression. Now, between imaginary and the real lies the symbolic. And the symbolic restructures the movement towards the imaginary in its encounter with reality. So symbolic remains as the controlling domain. It's an intermediary mediating domain between the imaginary and the real in Lacan. Now, this kind of a intermediate position of the subject is also Hegelian, because Hegel never gives that autonomy to the subject that it can break out of its own nexus of consciousness and can jump into a totally different gamut of consciousness. And therefore, Hegelian dialectic restricts the subject, just as Lacanian dialectic between the imaginary and the real restricts the subject, as opposed to Badiou's notion of subversive subject. Now, subversive subject assumes a kind of historical form, as Badiou would like to call it. Badiou calls it the historical sublime. The historical sublime of a subjective, of a subversive subject is like moving beyond what is immanent to a liminal point, to almost a point of annihilating the subjectivity. A subject which self-annihilates its own subjectivity in order to re-enter into the situation by a different route, by an alternative route, performs this strategic action of subverting the given symbolic as a kind of a strategy to escape the repression of the given symbolic. Is a subversive subject that subverts its own thought by way of an invisible subversion. And how does the subversive thought comes to the subject is an important question. Whether the subversive thought has a direct relation to the action of finding an alternative is another second level question. As far as thought is concerned, thought has to disentangle the structures of propositions or the structure of language in terms of which the subject represents the experience of reality, or the subject expresses the imaginary, or the subject expresses the encounter between the imaginary and the real. So language becomes a field of a huge contestation between a certain state of the situation and an emerging state of the situation, which the subject wants to bring by way of subverting the existing situation. And thereby language becomes a place of a huge contestation, a place of a huge upsurge, a place of an anarchic release of all kinds of possibilities within the field of language. Now, what is happening in language finds its grounding in the world. Language cannot itself self-subverse or reorder, restructure itself without finding its necessary ground in the field of action. So therefore, thought now disentangles the propositions. How does it disentangle the propositions of representation, and how exactly the subversion of the propositions of representation are carried out? A proposition metaphysically is a relationship between a subject and a predicate. A proposition has the place of a logical subject which is ascribed to a predicate, and the predicate is supposed to be generic, in which the logical subject is pushed as an individual, as a particular case, as an instantiation of that predication. Okay. So this is how a proposition is structured. Now, in order to subvert the generic procedure that Badiou is talking about is a procedure of subversion, and this procedure of subversion has to disentangle the terms of a proposition. It has to disentangle the terms of, let's say, something that is given and fixed. If it is a commodity, if X is a commodity, let's say, is a proposition, or if X is a situation, is a proposition. Now, terms of this proposition are to be disentangled in the form of separating the situation and the subject, in the form of separating the subject and the predicate, so that each term can independently become a term of thinking or a term of thought. And thought, once disentangles the terms of the propositions and works on each of these terms, then this work of thought on each of these terms is something that reorders the symbolic. It's something that opens up the possibility of a different kind of aesthetic, an aesthetic of subversion, or what Agamben very metaphorically called a falling aesthetics. A falling aesthetics that comes down from the level of the terms to the level of the world, without necessarily succumbing to a fixed objectivity, but by creating an effect with an A. The disentangled term creates an effect of subversion. And this effect of subversion is what is something like casting aside the reference. The reference of these terms are cast aside, and casting aside the reference of terms is an act of radical rethinking. And this act of radical rethinking is expressed as something which can never be unitary. Once again, multiplicity, plurality, and possibility of alternatives are all opened up when propositions are disentangled into terms of thinking, and each term of thought takes the subject in a certain direction that is available as an option within the language, and this opens up the language from inside. And once the language is opened up to the world from inside, what is happening is that language is no longer goal-driven. Language is no longer driven towards a certain kind of transcendence of the world. And language will not allow the world also to transcend itself. It's a certain kind of bringing together the subverted terms of language, the possibilities that the subverted terms open up, and a reenactment of the subjectivity in the entire metastructure, which has a generic procedure of reordering itself. And this is something that, very interestingly, Badiou Laruelle, who is a thinker of subjectivity in a non-philosophical mode, he talks about the possibility of disentangling terms of thought as I just read something as a kind of radical thought of individuals that ceases to be merely possible and becomes real as a thought of terms. and not as a thought of relations. A thought of terms before all relation is a thought of the one, you see. So a thought of terms before all relation can emerge. Although relation is not completely denied, relation is undeniable, because the disentangled terms of thought are immanent. They create a certain sense of strangeness, a certain kind of unfamiliarity with the familiar world, and this gives you a discomfiture sense of the real. Real is such that it sort of sunders a given symbolic order and is able to disentangle the terms into a variety of directions, as if it produces a different kind of a lens slide, a different kind of a sliding effect of the terms, moving in a variety of direction to capture the discomfort that real brings, or the sense of the real brings to the subject. And this sense of the real creates a certain kind of an auto-affection, a certain kind of an auto-sensibility. It's a certain kind of an auto-immunity, as a government calls it, that the subject auto-immunes itself with those disentangled subversive terms that takes the subject to a variety of possibilities opened up through this thought of the terms that arises before all relation. And this thought of the terms, as philosophical Laruelle describes, as something that is one. The proposition was one, the situation was one, the subject was one. From there, the disentangled terms, the experience of subverting the structured language, all within the metastructure of possible relations, is something that occupies and counts itself on, which earlier was not counted. The early count of one imbricated all these terms process of predication, which is now subverted into a process of impredication. Moving up a variety of terms in multiple directions, so that the known type causality, Laruelle points out, so that the known types of causality do not work anymore. The substantive type of causality that Aristotle talks about do not work anymore. So therefore, these terms of thought, subverted terms of thought, are politically now, Laruelle says, unlike minorities, they are like multiple rhizomes which open up to a variety of possibilities, and they are invisible, discerned from the grain of power, the available structure of production. It's possible to conceive of these multiple invisible minorities as disentangled terms of language, as subverted acts of the subject on the language, which do not have a fixed site except at the margins of a structure. Although these margins of the structure are called as a metastructure because they open up a possibility of re-entering into the structure. And therefore, they are more efficient. These disentangled terms are more efficient than the efficient cause. They assume a greater material force than the earlier materiality of language. And they are differential, and they also give rise to a new technology of resistance, or a new techno-political way of finding an alternative to the given structure, of forming a new criterion about reality. Each time assigning a disentangled term into a conjuncture, into an event, or into a practice, whose determination in the last instance is not ultimate or fixed. So it gives rise to a dilemma. Laruelle would say, a term as it is, nothing but term, is unthinkable. A term as it is unthinkable unless it is given from the language. Because either all thought is putting into relation, or it is a disguised return to the principle of identity. Identity of these terms with the prior language from where it is disentangled. So therefore, a kind of a hidden transcendental relationship comes back, even in the process of disentanglement. And therefore, one has to break from this disentangled terms, getting back to its original language. So how does one disentangle the disentanglement itself is the question that Laruelle is posing. And Laruelle is answering this question by saying that there is a certain kind of replacing and substituting these terms, as Derrida at one point of time talked about in terms of in his essay called Signature, Event, and Context, where he considered these entangled terms as signifiers or signs, and signs are something that gets dispersed the moment one writes, as Derrida says. And the moment one writes and produces a sign, signs enter into a relationship of difference, to differ and to differ. So these signs enter into a relationship of differing and differing. But they are differing and differing from a hidden transcendental language. And this is what Laruelle points out. So how does one get out of this hidden transcendence is the task of philosophy. The task of philosophy then is to question the impossibility of distinguishing between what is real and what is imaginary. Because a transcendental philosophy would finally subsume the real under the imaginary through the symbolic. If we have to go through Lacanian kind of understanding, if we have to go to Derridian kind of understanding, science should go to a process of destabilizing the language to the point that the language itself is perpetually differed into sets of meanings which come and go, never reaching to an ultimate point. And it's a kind of a perpetual process of suspension, just as the drive suspends the desire, and the desire suspends the drive. And therefore, one has to find a way out from this entanglement of the disentangled terms. And how can one find a way out? Now, this is where Laruelle is coming with his new idea of non-philosophy. He would say that these terms, disentangled term, from the point of view of systematic reason, it creates a certain kind of anarchy, a certain kind of catachresis, a certain kind of each term calling its opposite. No term can remain disentangled without calling up, without catching up to its opposite, which is called catachresis. And this is a kind of a protection that philosophy grants to language in a grammatical sense, that each term again calls for its catachresis, or each term tries to return to a hidden kind of transcendence. Now, the way to come out of it is a metaphysical move that Laruelle proposes. Laruelle says this situation is a given situation. A given situation that doesn't have any givenness into it. This situation doesn't presuppose that these terms can be reorganized into another fixed structure. It can only create a certain kind of a topology, a certain kind of a temporal delay, difference, which is evaluable It can be evaluated all the time as disentangled terms, but it is unavoidable in dealing with language, in dealing with the symbolic structure. So, so it's a kind of a phenomenological distance. It's a kind of a division. It's a kind of a distance between the act of thinking and the problem of thought of the term. So you can see here that there is a kind of a, Laruelle would say, there's a kind of a non-auto-positional drive. It's a drive which does not position itself on a fixed term, but a drive that sunders the term. And the notion of drive is never having an exact equivalence in terms of death, or in terms of love, or in terms of sex, or in terms of a labyrinth of psychological disorder or psychological order. So these terms are sort of free-floating, and they have the force of thought without turning themselves into something that is systematizable. And this is the shape of a perpetual immanence that, if you remember, Deleuze was talking about in terms of a kind of a swarm intelligence, a kind of a perpetuation of differences, to the extent that this difference cannot be conceptualized. The idea of difference becomes such that it's a difference between difference and non-difference, as Deleuze would like to call it, or he would simply put it, it's a concept of difference that cannot be conceptualized. So therefore, this is like pushing the subject beyond the limits of language, in a manner that the temporality of the situation of the subject can now never be predicated. And it will perpetually create a difference with its own identity, or would resist falling back into an identity. And a retro-thinking is no longer possible. So therefore, this is like a thunderbolt, Badiou would call it, which is followed by an invisible, imperceptible successor, the successor of subversion, which cannot be fitted into a Hegelian schema or into a schema of having a transcendental perspective on what is happening in the form of recovering the full consciousness of the subject. Rather, it will be something which is undecidable idiom, a labyrinth of temporalization, or it's a kind of a labyrinth of language beyond an idealist understanding of language, or beyond the possibility of interpreting language in terms of given set of rules. Now, this situation is also called a situation of poiesis, when these terms will cluster together into a variety of assemblages, into a variety of weak forces of resistance, which can be subtracted from capitalism, in a sense, can be withdrawn from capitalism, only to disalienate them again, and to bring them back into in the form of a subject, which is an other subject, which is a stranger for the world the way we know it. And therefore, such a possibility is theorized in so many ways by reconceptualizing the relationship between this kind of subverted subjects and the power relations. Power relations now can never fix the subjects into a process of subjectivation, into a process of subjugation. Now, this state of the subject is what Laruelle thinks as something that is non-transcendental, and something that is also very, very real. And he calls it the subject, this kind of a subject, as a kind of a human in human, which is the real of humanity. which is different from human in person, human in individual. It's a kind of a rehumanization of that which was repressed, that which was produced as something like giving rise to a kind of a systematic set of meanings, into a set of given political identities, without opening up the possible worlds that can disentangle them and can create a certain kind of changes and a certain kind of a transition, a certain kind of a critique of the existing world, which is called as transcritique, because this kind of a disentangled terms can be terms of critique only in the form of a critique of all possibilities of transcendence, where the condition of possibility of existence can be critiqued from within the language which describes that existence, by disentangling those terms and by allowing the subverted terms to reconfigure themselves in the form of elected subjects who can open up a different space of revolutionary change that Badiou talks about in terms of an intervention into the situation by way of a generic procedure. I think this is what I wanted to say. I think I have given a broad brush for discussion. There are many issues that we can discuss. If in the form of discussion, we can discuss more. Yeah. So over to you.